Okay, so now we know a little bit about Darwin. Let's talk about the other people around Darwin. We talked about the people who were before Darwin. Now we're going to talk about his contemporaries, the people who really led him to where he was. This is essentially the state of the art as far as science goes at the time of Darwin. The first person that I'm going to bring up is Thomas Malthus. This is him. Thomas Malthus was a demographer. And if you've never heard of demography before, what it means is basically categorizing people. And Thomas Malthus didn't really think much of what Darwin was doing because he wasn't working with the people as Malthus was. Malthus was concerned, in a way, about the poor of Europe, particularly of London. And his conclusions sound very familiar, and they're going to sound extremely similar to what ultimately became Darwin's idea of natural selection. A lot of people it's a slight misinterpretation to understand Darwin's natural selection as the survival of the fittest, and I'll tell you why. It's missing a very important part. Survival of the fittest sounds like the strongest survive. Only the strong shall survive. The idea that the bigger, stronger ones are going to be the survivors. That may well be the case, but in fact, the way that natural selection differs from that is the most fit for a given environment. If the environment changes, sometimes they're no longer that fit for that environment and they die out. They go extinct, to quote Georges Cuvier from a few lectures ago. So Thomas Malthus was looking only at the population of, in this case, London, and he was saying, the population, in other words, how large the population can be, is limited by resource supply, really food. Not everybody's going to survive. Those that have an advantage will live longer and produce more offspring, therefore they have a better chance of surviving. Sound familiar? This is virtually, almost word for word, what became Darwin's thesis of natural selection. That is, if an organism in a given environment has some form of an advantage to getting limited resources, that organism will live longer, have more babies, and the frequency of that mutation will go up in that population. So that should make a fair amount of sense. Thomas Malthus was also working in London with Darwin. They knew each other. Thomas Malthus was concerned with the poor of London and the fact that they may not survive, which of course completely backfired because then the very well-off said, oh, you mean the poor may just die out? Of course, that was a shallow and not very well thought out reaction, because of course the poor are the people who are making industry work and all of this that's going on with the Industrial Revolution. The rich had no idea. This brings me to probably my favorite person around Charles Darwin. His name is Thomas Henry Huxley. Huxley is, in his own right, an amazing biologist. He was doing some brilliant stuff. He was doing amazing science on his own. And in fact, he also went on a voyage around the world. It was a little tougher for him. He didn't have nearly as much money as Darwin, but he's brilliant. Thomas Huxley was one of the people, and remember I said Darwin was very hesitant to bring any attention to his ideas. Huxley was one of those who read his ideas and went, oh my God, man, this is brilliant. You should really bring this up at the next meeting of learned people here in London. Well, Darwin was kind of like, oh, I don't know. I don't think it's such a great idea. I'm kind of a dumbass compared to everybody else, blah, 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 blah. Thomas Huxley was literally afraid of no one. By the way, if you happen to watch that show Shameless, doesn't he look exactly like Lip in this photograph? Anyway, he became known as Darwin's bulldog because he so vehemently defended and brought to the fore Darwin's ideas. And of course, they're British, so what are you going to go with? A bulldog, of course. Well, he was a brilliant orator, meaning he was a great speaker. And he brought Darwin's arguments to pretty much the masses and would argue these things in front of thousands of people in some cases and brilliantly pull it off. This guy single-handedly really created a fervor around Darwin's ideas that Huxley thought they deserved. The theory of natural selection with Huxley went a long way, and he actually started to adopt it in his own papers. And a lot of people who looked at this guy and looked up to him, frankly, were following suit. So before Darwin even published his theory of natural selection, there was already published works that incorporated this idea, this hypothesis, which is absolutely phenomenal. All because of Huxley. Pretty cool guy. Alfred Russel Wallace was the second bit that really finally got Darwin to publish. Alfred Russel Wallace published a similar thing, but after Huxley had gotten Darwin's ideas out there in the learned group, not published yet, but other people were starting to talk about it, Wallace said, hey, he wrote to Darwin and he said, hey, man, I just assume that's what he sounds like because he looks kind of like Tommy Chong. So he sounds like Tommy Chong in my head. Hey, man, do you want to publish together? Because I've been seeing a lot of the same things going on in my work in South America, and I think that maybe we have a pretty good idea here. This was pretty much the proverbial last straw for Darwin. He then ran with it and said, you know what, I've got to publish now, or other scientists are going to scoop me. They're going to get this idea and get it published in their own name, and it would be Wallace's theory of natural selection, not Darwin's. Don't feel too bad for Wallace. He's actually an extremely well-known, very famous biologist. You will hear his name if you ever take organic chemistry or biology, really. You'll hear about Wallace. In fact, there's a Wallace line on the map in the Pacific Islands. He's a pretty impressive fellow. He got a lot of other things done, but failed to join Darwin, which is okay. That's fair. Darwin came up with these ideas nearly 30 years before. So really, credit where credit's due. Darwin should get the credit for this. This brings me to probably the most brilliant single person in this entire talk. Now, keep in mind, the thing about Darwin is not that Darwin really invented anything. Darwin tied all of these completely unrelated areas of science. All of them had these theories that the earth was changing, things were changing fairly quickly. The driving force behind that change was really this idea of natural selection. In a way, Darwin produced a theory that unified all of these other theories that were already floating out there in science. This is known, not surprisingly, as a unifying theory, which made a lot of people very famous. Not Darwin's unifying theory, it just made him famous, but unifying theories in all sciences are incredible. Einstein created a unifying theory that made him very famous. Fermi, Oppenheimer, the list goes on and on and on and on and on of people who had a unifying theory that brought things together. Hubble, of the Hubble telescope fame. Gregor Mendel, though, gave what Darwin was saying the legs it needed. But Gregor Mendel, who was contemporary with Darwin, but they didn't know about each other. Mendel probably knew of Darwin after Darwin published, but Mendel never really went to the forefront and outwardly published his stuff, at least not in a scientific realm. Gregor Mendel, you can probably figure out, was a monk. He was living in what at the time they called Bohemia. Nowadays we call the Czech Republic. He was a brilliant man. He was a monk, but he had a scientist's mind. His experiments, the mental gymnastics that he went through to create his experiments and glean the information he did from what he was working with is nothing short of astounding. This guy has probably the greatest mind in science that I can think of. Yeah, Stephen Hawking is up there. There's others who are pretty bright. But this guy, with what he had to work with, pretty amazing stuff. He is the inventor of the Punnett square. Now, I can hear you already. If you had Punnett squares in high school, you're probably moaning right now, thinking that we're going to go through 1,000 Punnett squares. We're not. But it is important that you understand how Punnett squares work to answer questions on the exam. My point being, I'm going to go through Punnett squares very quickly with you guys, but if you haven't been exposed to Punnett squares before, or if it leaves you in the dark and you're thinking, oh God, if this is a refresher, fantastic. If it's brand new and at the end of my explanation you still don't fully grasp this, I think it's a very good idea between now and the exam to go online, do a couple of online Punnett squares. It's very easy to find. They're spelled out right here, Punnett. You can find them everywhere. They're in the back of the textbook as well. If you want to do a few Punnett squares until you fully understand this, that's a fantastic idea. But don't worry, those of you who know this stuff, we're not going to do a bunch of busy work. All right, let's talk about what we're talking about. First of all, Gregor Mendel was working with pea plants. Again, if you associate Darwin with the finches and the Galapagos Islands, you probably associate Mendel with pea plants. The lowly pea plant. This is all he had to work with, and the astonishing thing is, literally everything we know about genetics came from this crazy idea that this monk had sheltered away in the middle of Bohemia in the 1800s. This is amazing. It's amazing. And what he came up with is quite astonishing. He realized that he could understand how parent to offspring trait transmission sound familiar. It should bring up things of Lamarck. And I mentioned even when I was talking about Lamarck a long time ago, Mendel. Because Mendel made sense of what Lamarck was trying to do. He called these the mechanisms of inheritance. And they had a few meaningful rules. Before we go too far, I want you to know, full disclaimer, we don't use human organisms, humans, in fact, most higher organisms, do not adhere to Mendelian genetics, only because it's not that easy. Pea plant genetics, not surprisingly, are a little more simple than human or even your dog's genetics. But it is a fantastic way of understanding how genetics work and probably assessing how we use a lot of these terms that Mendel came up with incorrectly in day-to-day parlance. So we're going to sort of show you how it works in science, and it should clarify a lot. Number one, his first rule was that they are discrete. What he's talking about are, as we now know, genes, but he called them particles of inheritance. We now know them as genes because somebody else who came along after all these guys in the 20th century, and we'll talk about him later on. But they are discrete. That means if one trait changes, it doesn't affect any of the other key traits that he's going to point out here. And I'll explain all of this with a nice graphic in just a minute. The second major thing is that the traits do not blend together. Again, I'll clarify this in the next slide. Alternate forms of a gene are called alleles. We call them alleles now. And that means that, for example, you can have a pea plant with a red flower and a pea plant with a white flower. They're both flowers. They both do the same thing for that pea plant, but they are different forms of the same thing. Those are alleles. The most familiar allele that you probably know about is your blood type. Blood in somebody who's AB positive does the same thing as blood in somebody who's O negative. But the O and AB are alleles of the same thing, blood. These alleles, his last rule, can either be dominant or recessive. Now, I'm positive you've heard these terms before. The dominant allele of hair, for example, amongst people. You might hear, oh, black hair is dominant. Red and blonde hair are recessive. Great. But what does that mean? Well, we'll look at a Punnett square and we'll understand a little bit more clearly what dominance and recession means. First, let's look at that wonderful picture I told you we'd look at and clarify what all of these things mean. Okay, here we have 7 different traits of pea plants. The first one is where the flowers grow out of the plant. It can either be at the end, terminal, or in the middle, axial. The flower color can either be white or purple. The plant height can be tall or short, which is the one that we'll kind of concentrate on in this example of the Punnett squares. Pea shape can be round or wrinkled. Pea color can be yellow or green. Pod shape, inflated or constricted, and pod color, yellow or green. So let me ask you in your head, if the pea is round, is it going to be green or yellow? Is that round green or yellow pea going to come from an inflated or constricted pod shape? And is that pod shape going to be yellow or green? The bottom line is it could be any of the above. You can have a round yellow pea in a constricted pod that's green. You can have a wrinkled yellow pea in a constricted pod that's yellow or green. What I'm saying is each one of these does not affect any of the others. You can have a round or wrinkled pea. It could be either yellow or green. These two things, the color and the shape of the pea, have nothing to do with each other. This means they are discrete. They do not affect each other. Does that make sense? Next, let's go to the next rule. They don't blend. So, for clarity's sake, I'm going to change the purple flower to a red flower, just to clarify this. Let's say we have a parent plant, dad plant has white flowers, mom plant has red flowers. What color are the offspring plant flowers going to be? If you said pink, you're wrong. They're either going to be red or white because they don't blend. Claro? Does that make sense? They don't blend. So it's red or white, or in reality, purple or white. Make sense? Now the last thing, dominance and recession, is much clearer shown if we look at a Punnett square. But before we go to that, I want you to realize that all of the things on the upper half of this chart and on the lower half of the chart, a yellow or green pea, those are different alleles of the pea color. Round or wrinkled, alleles of pea shape. Plant height, tall or short, alleles of the plant height. Okay? Alleles are different forms of the same thing. Inflated, constricted pod, yellow or green. Make sense? Okay, let's look at a Punnett square. Now, to understand these, unfortunately, we have to understand a whole bunch of terminology. Not too much, but a little bit, that may be new to some of you. So, first of all, parent 1, we'll call him Dad. Up at the top, he's tall, okay? Tall is his outward appearance after the colon. Do you see it? His genetics are big T, big T. That's in the parentheses. Do you see that? So, parent 1 is big T, big T. Why are there 2 T's? Because you get half of your genetic information from your dad and half from whom? Your mother. So you've got 2 parents, you've got 2 sets of your genes, right? Okay. So 1 T comes from mom, 1 T comes from dad. these get together. They're both capital T's, which, by the way, is the dominant trait here. So tall is the dominant trait. Okay? So Dad is tall. He's got two capital T's. He got one capital T from his mom, one capital T from his dad. So what does he have to give away as far as genetics go? Only capital T's. Does that make sense? So here we go down into our Punnett square. Dad's got a capital T to give. Dad's got a capital T to give. All of his offspring are going to have a capital T in their genetics because that's all he's got. Conversely, let's go over to mom, parent 2. Mom is short. That's what she looks like, her outward appearance. Dad's tall, she's short. She, in her genetics, has T, but they're lowercase. She has lowercase t, lowercase t. She got a lowercase t from mom, lowercase t from dad. All she has to give away are lowercase t's. Making sense so far? Now, their first offspring, here he is, gets a capital T from dad, little t from mom. What is he, tall or short? Well, since capital T, which means tall, is the dominant trait, here's the recessive. It's small, it's in there, but it doesn't show up in their outward appearance. So this kid is going to look tall. Same thing here. Kid number 2 gets big T from dad, little t from mom, because that's all they have to give away. He is tall because he's got that dominant tall in there. Same for the third kid, same for the fourth kid. Makes sense to everybody? Now, we have a big T, little t in everybody in the second generation. So generation 1, we had a pureblood. I'm doing that with air quotes. Tall, and a pureblood, air quotes, short. Pureblood was what Mendel called them. So now we'll go to generation 2. It looks very similar, but now we've got parent 1, we'll call him dad again. Parent 1 has a capital T, little t in his genetics, and his outward appearance, tall. So he's got a big T and a little t to give away. Big T from dad, little t from mom. Same with parent 2. She's also tall. She's got a big T in there and also a little t, but her outward appearance is tall, so she's got both to give away. Now it starts to get a little interesting. Their offspring are more interesting genetically. Now we've got a big T from dad, big T from mom, 2 big T's. What's this kid going to look like? He's going to be tall. A little t from dad, a big T from mom, a big T and a little t, but big T is dominant, so that's what you see in the outward appearance. This kid is tall. Third kid, same story. Big T from dad this time, little t from mom this time. Big T, little t, big T's dominant. He looks tall. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. A little t from mom, a little t from dad. This one, little t, the recessive trait finally gets a chance to show through. This one looks short. So if we look at the percentages, the percentage of being dominant for everything, having nothing but dominant genes, is 25%. The percentage of having nothing but recessive genes, being short, is 25%. And the percentage of having one of each and still being tall is 50%. But here's the other interesting thing. As far as outward appearance, the talls go together. So you actually have 75% are tall and only 25%, or a quarter of them, are short. Does that make sense? Now, let's get into some more terminology that we're missing here, just a little bit. The first thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is the T's in their genetics and the look, their outward appearance. So if they have a big T and a little t, These are dissimilar. Things that are different are hetero. So they're hetero, different. Zygous means genetics or genes. So they're a heterozygote or heterozygous. Big T, little t. Heterozygous, dominant, tall. That's how we would describe that. Homozygous, big T, big T. Homo means the same. Homozygous, big T, dominant, tall. You can also have a homozygous recessive, can't you? If I had a little t here, it would be homozygous recessive short. So I'd say homozygous recessive short. Make sense? Those big T's and little t's are called their genotype. That's their genetic makeup. On the other side of the colon, whether they were tall or short, their outward appearance is their phenotype. Genes, phonetics means outward appearance. So, if I have black hair, can you tell from my outward appearance my genotype? The outward look, the outward appearance would be black hair, which is a dominant trait. Can I see a dominant trait? Can I tell whether that's a heterozygote or a homozygote if they have black hair? I can't tell. I can't tell the genotype. They might be big T dominant. They might have a hidden recessive in there that you can't see because the dominance is there. However, what if I've got red hair, which is a recessive trait? Can I tell her genotype from that? I can, because the genotype is reflected in the phenotype because the phenotype is recessive, which means she cannot have a dominant trait in her genes, that big T. Therefore, she has to be little t for red hair. So I can tell she's a homozygote recessive red. Does that make sense to you guys? I hope so. If it doesn't, you may need to go back and look at this video a little bit more, or maybe go through and do a few Punnett squares on your own to understand those aspects. So, if I have parent 1 here, I would describe as what? Hetero or homozygote? Heterozygote, dominant, tall. Heterozygote, dominant, tall. Homozygote, dominant, tall. Homozygote, recessive, short. These two are heterozygotes, just like their parents. Does that make sense? I hope so. Should. Recessive traits only appear in a homozygote because you can only see the recessive coming out in its phenotype if it does not have the dominant genetics. That's important.